I still remember standing on that porch. It was a Monday morning in October. The air smelled like dead leaves and something burning 2 houses down. I had 2 bags at my feet, just 2. One had my clothes, the other had everything I thought mattered at the time. My brother Tom was standing in the doorway. Not moving, not stepping aside, just standing there with his arms crossed and this look on his face like I was a stranger who'd knocked on the wrong door. He said, "You need to go." That was it. No explanation, no apology, not even a blink. This was my father's house, the house I grew up in, the house where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I cried into my pillow the night my mom passed, where my dad used to sit in that green recliner by the window every single evening watching the news with the volume too loud. And Tom told me I needed to go. I picked up my bags, I walked to my car, and for a minute I just sat in the driver's seat staring at the house. I told myself it was temporary, that things would calm down, that grief makes people act crazy. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined sitting there, was that Tom had been planning that moment for almost 2 years. And what I really didn't know, what changed absolutely everything, was that my father had been planning something too. 3 days later, I got a phone call from a woman named Patricia Hendricks. She said she was an attorney. She said my father had come to see her 8 months before he died. And she said, very calmly, "There's another will. And you need to know what's in it." I didn't understand what that meant yet, not fully. But by the time I did, by the time I sat in that courtroom and heard the judge say what he said, I realized my father had been fighting for me the whole time. Quietly, carefully, in a way I never knew about until it was almost too late. This is that story, and it's not a short one, because none of it happened fast, and none of it was simple, and I need you to understand all of it. If you've ever been blindsided by someone in your own family, someone you trusted, someone you grew up with, this story is going to hit different. Stay with me, because nothing about this was straightforward, and nothing went the way I expected. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I tell stories like this one, long and real, and people keep coming back because life doesn't wrap itself up in 5 minutes. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Rebecca, and what you need to know about me first is that I'm not someone who looks for problems. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house in a mid-sized city in Ohio. My dad, Raymond, was a quiet man. Genuinely quiet, not the sad kind, just the kind of man who thought for a long time before he said anything, and when he finally did say something, it meant something. He worked for 32 years in construction management. He wasn't the guy with the hard hat building things with his hands. He was the one who made sure projects stayed on schedule, on budget, and didn't fall apart from the inside. He was precise, detail-oriented in a way that most people aren't. He kept notebooks, actual paper notebooks, spiral-bound, different colors, with records of everything: receipts, dates, phone calls, sometimes full conversations. It's just how his mind worked. He never trusted himself to remember things perfectly, so he wrote them down. That habit would end up mattering more than I can explain right now. My mom passed when I was 16. Ovarian cancer. She was gone in 11 months. After that, it was just the 3 of us. Dad, me, and Tom. Tom is 6 years older than me. When Mom got sick, he was already in college, so he wasn't home for most of it. I was the one who drove her to appointments. I was the one who sat in those waiting rooms reading old magazines and trying not to look at the other families sitting in those same chairs for the same reasons. I was the one who learned, at 16, that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. After Mom passed, Tom stepped into a role. Dad's right-hand man, the eldest son, the one who made the decisions. And Dad let him. I think grief does that to people. It makes you hand over control because you don't have the energy to hold it yourself anymore. Tom became a real estate agent in his late 20s, did pretty well for himself. Always had a nice car, nice clothes, that easy smile that worked on strangers. He was charming in that practiced way, the kind of charm that feels smooth until you've known someone long enough to notice the seams. I became a 5th-grade teacher. I wasn't making a lot of money, but I loved it. I had a small apartment about 20 minutes from Dad's house, and I checked on him a few times a week. We'd have dinner, watch whatever game was on, and sit in comfortable silence the way people do when they've been around each other long enough to not need to fill every pause. For years, things were fine. Not perfect, but fine. But then, maybe a year before everything fell apart, I started noticing something. Something small enough to dismiss. Tom started coming around a lot more. Not just dropping by, really coming around. Dinner twice a week, driving Dad to his doctor's appointments, offering to manage Dad's finances because, as Tom put it, Dad doesn't need that stress at his age. I thought that was generous. I remember telling a coworker at school, I think Tom has finally stepped up. It's good for Dad. Looking back, I want to shake myself. Dad had a stroke in February. It wasn't massive, not the kind that leaves you paralyzed or unable to speak. But it was enough. He was in the hospital for 12 days, and when he came home, he wasn't quite the same. He got confused sometimes, had trouble with dates, occasionally repeated a story he'd told 10 minutes earlier without realizing it. The doctors called it mild cognitive impairment. They said it was common after a stroke of that type. They said he could still live at home with the right support. Tom moved into the house 2 weeks after Dad came home from the hospital. He said it was temporary. He said Dad needed someone there full-time. I didn't argue. I started going over more too. Cooking, cleaning, sitting with Dad in the evenings while Tom was out, or on the phone in the other room. And honestly, during those first few weeks, it felt like we were a real family again. Something about watching someone you love become more fragile just pushes everything aside. The old irritations, the quiet distances. They all seemed small when I was sitting across from my father at the kitchen table watching him slowly get his strength back. But then, about 6 weeks after the stroke, Dad said something to me. We were sitting at that kitchen table. He was eating soup. I was going through some of his mail, sorting what needed attention. He looked up at me. He said, Rebecca. That's my name, just that, my name. He said, I need to talk to you about something. I put the mail down. I looked at him. He had that look on his face, the one he got before he said something important, like he was choosing every word carefully. He opened his mouth, and then Tom walked in from the other room, and Dad just stopped. He looked at Tom, then back down at his soup, and he said, Never mind, it'll keep. I thought he'd lost his train of thought. I thought it was the stroke. That memory has lived in me every day since. Because now I think he was afraid. Dad passed away 4 months later, heart failure. He went in his sleep, in his own room, in the bed he and my mom had shared for 30 years. Tom called me at 6 in the morning on a Thursday. I drove over in the dark and kept thinking, he's really gone. And even though I'd seen it coming, even though I thought I was prepared, nothing actually prepares you. The next few days were a fog. Phone calls and paperwork and neighbors bringing casseroles. I cried in my car a lot, because I didn't want Tom to see me. I didn't fully understand why at the time, just something about the way he moved through those days, so organized and efficient, so already handled, made me want to keep my grief to myself. The night before the funeral, I stayed at the house, slept in my old room for the first time in years, stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle. In the morning, I came downstairs, and Tom was already sitting at the kitchen table. He had a folder in front of him. He slid it across to me. He said, Dad's will. I sat down and I opened the folder. It was a 2-page document, very clean, very formal, dated 8 months earlier, June of the previous year. I read through it once. Then I read it again more slowly. The house went to Tom. 2 savings accounts, both listed by number, went to Tom. Dad's truck, his tools, the contents of the house, all Tom. There was one line about me. It said I would receive personal effects as designated by Tom Raymond Caldwell at his sole discretion. I sat with that for a moment. I said, What does this mean, personal effects? Tom said, It means whatever he specifically left for you. His watch, maybe some of Mom's jewelry, some photos, things like that. At your sole discretion, I said. That means you decide what that is. He folded his hands on the table. Rebecca, this is what Dad wanted. I looked down at the signature. Raymond Earl Caldwell. I had seen my father's signature hundreds of times, thousands. Birthday cards, permission slips, checks, Christmas envelopes with a 20 tucked inside. Something about the signature on this document looked slightly different. I couldn't explain what, exactly. Slightly tighter, slightly less assured. Like someone trying to recreate something from memory rather than just doing it. I said, "Can I take a copy of this?" Tom said of course. He said he'd have his attorney, his own personal attorney, not a neutral party, handle the estate process and keep me updated. He was so calm, so completely prepared. And that's when something small clicked for me. Not a dramatic moment. Just a quiet, cold click. He'd had that folder ready, already sitting on the table before I came downstairs. Like he'd known I'd come down, and he'd wanted to be there first. The funeral was the way funerals are when someone has lived a long, decent life. People stood up and said kind things. An old coworker talked about how Raymond always kept perfect records, always had documentation for everything, never cut corners on a project because he believed that cutting corners just meant the problems showed up later instead of sooner. It was such a specific thing to remember about someone, but everyone who knew Dad nodded because it fit him exactly. On the drive home from the cemetery, I thought about those notebooks. Dad's paper notebooks, the ones he'd always kept. I hadn't seen them recently. And that should have registered sooner than it did. 3 days after the funeral, I went back to the house. Tom was there. I told him I wanted to go through some of Dad's things, maybe spend a couple hours in his room. Tom said, "I'd rather you wait." Just like that, "I'd rather you wait." I said, "Wait for what?" He said, "Until the estate is properly settled. I don't want anything moved or misplaced." I looked at him. I said, "He was my dad too, Tom." Tom said, "I know that. But legally, until everything is finalized, I think it's better if you don't." "Legally?" I said. "What does legally have to do with me sitting in my dad's bedroom?" His jaw tightened. Just for a second. He said, 2 weeks, Rebecca. Give it 2 weeks, please." I left. I sat in my car outside for a few minutes, and then I called my Aunt Dorothy, my dad's younger sister, who lives in North Carolina, who had hugged me at the funeral and pressed money into my hand like I was still 12 years old. I told her about the will, what it said about me. There was a long pause on her end. She said, "Honey, your daddy called me. About 2 weeks before he passed. He said he needed to tell me something important. But Tom walked in and he said he'd call me back." My hand tightened on the phone. "Did he?" I said. "Call you back?" She said, "No, baby, he didn't." That conversation with Dorothy did something to me. It planted something I couldn't ignore, no matter how much part of me wanted to. I went home that night and I wrote down everything I could remember from the past year and a half. Not because I thought it would become evidence. At that point, I didn't even know what I was looking for. I just needed to see it all in one place. Tom, gradually taking over the finances. Tom, driving Dad to every appointment. The way Dad had started seeming quieter when Tom was in the room. The kitchen table moment, the stopped sentence, the "it'll keep." And one more thing I'd almost forgotten. 6 weeks before Dad passed, I'd come to the house on a Saturday morning and found a man in the living room I'd never met. Tom had introduced him as Greg Callahan. A financial advisor, he said, helping Dad organize his estate. Dad had nodded when Tom said that. He hadn't added anything, not a word. I'd shaken Greg's hand, made polite conversation, and then Greg left and I moved on with my day. Now I was thinking about that meeting very differently. I called my own attorney. Not a sophisticated attorney, a guy named Dan who'd helped me with my apartment lease a couple of years ago. I told him the situation. He listened. And the very first thing he said was that I needed to get a copy of the official will on file with the probate court. If Tom filed for probate, he said, the will becomes public record. You have every right to request it. I requested it the next day. The official will on file was the same document Tom had shown me. Same date, June of the prior year. But Dan looked it over and said, "This was prepared by a firm called Whitfield and Associates." I need you to think. Did your father have any other legal representation? Any attorney he used in the past, even years ago? I said Dad wasn't someone who hired lawyers regularly. Dan said, people with property usually have someone on file, even if they only use them once. Dig through whatever records you can access. I still had access to an old family email account. Dad used it mostly to forward news articles to himself and respond to chain mail from his fishing buddies. But I scrolled back, further and further, until I found something from 4 years ago. An email from a firm called Hendricks & Park, a woman named Patricia Hendricks. The subject line read, "Follow-up from our meeting, estate planning." 4 years earlier, my dad had met with an estate attorney, not Whitfield and Associates. I sat with that for a long time. Then I noticed the email address Patricia Hendricks had used was slightly different from the firm's main address, more personal, like she'd reached out to him directly after the meeting. I almost closed the laptop. I almost talked myself out of it, told myself I was reading into things, told myself grief was making me paranoid. But the will was dated 8 months before Dad died, and he'd met with an estate attorney 4 years ago, and those two facts didn't fit together quietly. I found the number for Hendricks & Park, and I called. I left a message, said my father was Raymond Caldwell, said I had questions about his estate, left my number. I didn't hear back that day, or the next. On the 9th day after the funeral, Tom called me. He said he needed me to come get my belongings from the house. I said, "My belongings?" He said anything I'd left there over the years, my old room. He said he needed to start getting the house ready. I said, "Ready for what?" He said, and I can still hear his exact tone, that flat, casual certainty. "I'm going to list it, probably by end of next month." I sat down on my couch. "You're selling the house," I said. "It makes financial sense. I don't need a house in Ohio. Market's decent right now." "Tom, that is our parents' house." "It's my house, Rebecca." No hesitation, no apology. The will is clear. I drove over the next morning. I filled my car with what I could. Clothes from the closet in my old room, a box of books, the photo albums from the hall shelf. Tom stood in the kitchen the entire time, not helping, not leaving, just present, watching. On my last trip through, I walked through the living room. I looked at Dad's recliner, the green one, still by the window, a little worn on the armrests. His mug was on the side table, the Ohio State one, the faded one he'd used every morning for as long as I could remember. I picked it up. Tom said, "That should probably stay. For the estate inventory." I set it back down. I looked at my brother. He looked back at me. And I walked out. I sat in the car in the street for a minute, looked at the front of the house. The brick face, the maple tree in the yard, the one Dad had planted when Tom was born. The porch where Mom and I used to sit on summer evenings. I pulled away, and I told myself, I am not letting this go. Patricia Hendricks called me back 48 hours later. She said, "I'm very sorry for your loss. I remember your father well." She asked me some questions, confirming who I was, my relationship to Raymond, my contact information, standard. Then she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted. More deliberate. She said, "Has the estate gone into probate yet?" I said Tom had filed. I wasn't sure where things stood. She said, "Has a will been submitted to the court?" I said yes, and I described what I knew about it. Long pause. She said, "Rebecca, your father came to see me 8 months before he died." My stomach dropped. He came to me specifically because I'd helped him with documents 4 years ago, and he remembered me. He trusted me, and he was very clear that he didn't want your brother to know about it. I couldn't find words for a moment. "He signed documents with me," she said. "I have them, and he left me a safety deposit box number with specific instructions." I said, "What's in the box?" She said, "I think you already know." I said, "Another will." She said, "Yes." I need to stop here for a moment. Because when she said that, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anything close to satisfaction. What I felt was grief. Deep, aching, specific grief. Because what that meant was that my father, in the last year of his life, had been scared. Scared enough to quietly hire an attorney without telling a soul. Scared enough to take a rideshare to her office so there was no car in the driveway. Scared enough that he couldn't finish a sentence at the kitchen table when his son walked into the room. He knew something was wrong. He knew what Tom was doing. And he tried, in his quiet and careful way, to protect me anyway. That's what I sat with for a long time after I hung up that call. Patricia said we needed to meet in person. She also said something that I took seriously. Be careful about who you talk to. She said, if this is what I believe it is, Tom will try to get ahead of it the moment he realizes you know. Don't give him that chance. I asked her what she thought it was. Exactly. She chose her words the way my dad would have, carefully. She said, I've seen situations like this before. An adult child who has access to a vulnerable parent, control over finances, over medical appointments, over who the parent talks to and when. A new will that conveniently leaves everything to that one person. It follows a pattern. I said, you think the will Tom submitted is fraudulent? She said, I think your father was a precise and deliberate man who came to me for a very specific reason, 8 months ago, and did not come by accident. I met with Patricia 3 days later at her office. She was in her mid-50s, small, with short gray hair and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. Her office had books on every wall and a lamp on the desk and that particular kind of quiet that makes you feel like things are being handled carefully. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a will, dated 8 months before Dad died, but not the one Tom had shown me. In this will, Dad's real will, as I came to think of it, the house came to me. The 2 savings accounts were split equally, half to me and half to Tom. His tools and personal items to be divided fairly. And near the end, a specific personal bequest that I wasn't expecting. My Ohio State coffee mug to my daughter Rebecca. Because she was there. I had to stop reading. Patricia let me sit with it for as long as I needed. She didn't say anything. She just waited. When I looked up, she said, there's something else. She slid a second document across the desk. A letter. In my father's handwriting. It wasn't long, maybe a page and a half, but it was one of the clearest things I've ever read, because every word had been chosen deliberately, the way he chose everything. He wrote that beginning about 18 months before his stroke. Tom had gradually taken over his finances. He wrote that accounts had been moved, that money had been transferred into structures he didn't understand, that Tom had explained it as tax planning and estate organization, and Dad had trusted him. He wrote that after the stroke, when his thinking wasn't as sharp, he'd realized things had moved further than he'd understood. He'd tried to ask about specific accounts and Tom had told him he was misremembering, that the confusion was from the stroke. That everything was fine, Dad. Just rest. He wrote about a man named Greg Callahan, the financial advisor. He wrote that Callahan had appeared around the same time Tom started managing things, and that Callahan had helped set up the new financial structure. He wrote that he had asked Tom about specific accounts, amounts he knew he should have, and that Tom had provided explanations that, when Dad quietly tried to verify them with his own records, did not add up. He wrote, I do not fully understand everything that has been done, but I am not as confused as Tom believes I am, and I do not want my daughter to have nothing. She was always the one who sat with me. I put the letter down on the desk. Patricia gave me time. Then she said, your father estimated, and the financial documentation we've recovered from the safety deposit box supports this, that Tom had moved or spent approximately $300,000 from accounts your father controlled over a period of about 2 years. $300,000. I said, my father wasn't a rich man. She said, no. But he worked for 32 years, and he was careful with money his entire life, and he had a house that he'd owned for decades, fully paid off. I understood it then, all of it. The savings accounts that the fraudulent will left to Tom, Dad's letter suggested those had already been largely drained. The real remaining asset was the property, the house, and Tom was already listing it. He needed to move fast because there wasn't much time before someone started asking questions. Every day that house sat unsold was a day someone could stop him. What I discovered next completely changed the way I understood my brother. Patricia had been doing her own research since Dad's initial visit to her office 8 months earlier. She'd been careful, quiet, not making any moves until she heard from me. But she'd identified something about Whitfield and Associates, the firm that had produced Tom's version of the will. The firm had only been in business for about 2 years. It was small, 2 named partners. And one of those partners was Greg Callahan, not a financial advisor, a disbarred attorney from another state who had changed his name slightly, moved, and reinvented himself as a financial advisor, and apparently as part of a law firm whose legitimacy was, to put it mildly, questionable. I sat in that office and felt the room tilt slightly. Tom hadn't just found a crooked will preparer. He'd brought him in himself. He'd introduced him as a financial advisor. He'd used him to drain the accounts and to produce the fraudulent will. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't grief making someone act crazy. This was planned. That realization, that this had been planned over years, not days, changed something in me. Because it meant that everything Tom had done around me during that time was deliberate. Every reassuring word, every "let me handle it," every moment where I thought he was stepping up, all of it calculated. And here was what started keeping me awake at night. Patricia had one more thing she wanted to investigate. She said, very carefully, "There's a class of medication that, at higher doses, can cause significant cognitive impairment in elderly patients. Confusion, memory gaps, difficulty with decision-making, reduced ability to understand what they're signing. If someone with access to a vulnerable adult was adjusting their dosage," I said, "someone would have to be managing that." She nodded. "Who took your father to his medical appointments in the months after his stroke?" I already knew the answer. Tom had been managing every appointment. He'd been the family contact. He'd been the one who relayed information between Dad and the doctors, who picked up prescriptions, who explained what the doctors had said. Patricia requested Dad's medical records through the probate process. What we found was this. In the 6 weeks before the fraudulent will was signed, Dad's dosage of a sedative medication had been significantly increased. The clinical notes showed the increase had been recommended by, and I remember reading this and feeling something cold settle in my chest, a family member, not a physician. The prescribing doctor's notes indicated the family member had reported increased agitation and disorientation. Dad's records from his independent evaluation, before Tom had full control, showed no such agitation. Someone had reported symptoms that didn't exist. And that recommendation had been used to increase a medication that would have made my father more confused, more compliant, more likely to sign something without fully understanding it. I thought about that moment at the kitchen table, Dad looking up at me. "I need to talk to you about something," and then Tom walking in, and Dad looking back down at his soup. He wasn't confused in that moment. He was afraid. And I had not protected him. I hadn't known he needed protecting, but the weight of that still sits with me. Patricia was methodical. She didn't rush. The safety deposit box had been the foundation, the real will, the letter, and bank statements going back 18 months that documented transfers, withdrawals, and account closures in a pattern that told a very clear story. From there, Patricia engaged a forensic document examiner. This is someone who specializes in verifying signatures, identifying inconsistencies, and determining whether a document was signed under unusual conditions. The examiner compared the signature on Tom's version of the will to verified samples of Dad's handwriting from a range of documents, before and after his stroke. The written conclusion: significant inconsistencies consistent with forgery or signing under physical or cognitive duress. In other words, the signature wasn't right. Then there was Aunt Dorothy. Dorothy provided a formal written statement about the unanswered phone calls in the last 2 weeks of Dad's life, about how she'd tried to reach him 6 times and gotten a voicemail that had never been set up. She hadn't known, until I told her, that Tom had replaced Dad's cell phone with one that Tom controlled as account manager, a phone Dad couldn't use to call anyone without Tom knowing. That detail alone made my stomach turn. And then there was Mrs. Aguilar. the neighbor who'd lived next door for 15 years. Patricia's investigator spoke with her, and she said, without being prompted, that she'd noticed Rebecca used to come by quite regularly, but in the last year she hadn't seen her as often. She'd seen an unfamiliar car there frequently, a man she didn't recognize. And she said she'd been gardening near the fence one afternoon and heard my father's voice through the window, clear as anything. He'd said, "I don't want to sign that." She hadn't known what it referred to. She'd assumed it was some kind of bill. We knew what it referred to. Patricia told me what needed to happen next. We had enough to challenge the will in probate court. We had the competing will, the forensic analysis, the bank records, Dorothy's statement, the medical records, the neighbor's account, and the evidence that Greg Callahan was operating under a false professional identity. But she warned me about something important. She said, "Tom's attorneys will delay. They'll challenge the authenticity of the documents I hold. They'll argue your father's capacity when he signed with me. They'll counterclaim. This could drag out. And while it drags out, Tom will try to liquidate whatever he can." She was going to file for an emergency injunction, a court order freezing the estate, halting the house sale and any account activity, pending the will challenge. She needed to file fast. Before Tom realized anything was happening, she said, "Does Tom know about me?" I said, "I don't think so." She said, "Your father came to my office by rideshare, paid the notary fee in cash. He was very deliberate about keeping this quiet." I thought about my father, 71 years old, post-stroke, ordering a rideshare on a phone Tom didn't control, paying cash, keeping secrets, doing all of that for me. I said, "File whatever you need to file." She filed the emergency injunction on a Friday afternoon, and I went home, and I did not call Tom, did not text him, did not give him any indication that anything was happening. That weekend was the longest of my life. Monday morning, 9:47 a.m., Tom called. His voice was different from any version of Tom I'd heard before. Tight, controlled in the way that means someone is working very hard to stay controlled. He said, "Did you hire a lawyer?" I said, "Why?" He said, "Don't play games with me. The house sale is being contested. The estate is frozen. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" I said, "I think I do, yeah. Dad left me the house. That's what the will says." I said, "There's more than one will, Tom." Silence. Real silence. The kind that has weight. Then he said, "You don't know what you're talking about." I said, "I know about Greg Callahan. I know about Whitfield and Associates. I know about the accounts. I know about the appointments." Another silence, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone very quiet and very flat. He said, "You have no idea what you're getting into." I said, "Maybe not, but I know what Dad wanted." And I hung up. I sat there for a minute, shaking, not from fear, or not only from fear, from something I hadn't felt since before Dad died, from knowing I was right. The formal probate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. Patricia had requested what amounted to a competing will presentation, both documents to be presented to the probate judge, along with all supporting evidence, and the judge to determine which instrument was valid and how the estate would proceed. Tom showed up with 2 attorneys. I showed up with Patricia, a folder of documents, and a handwritten letter from my dead father. The courtroom was small, wood paneling, fluorescent lighting. A judge named Hartwell who had the look of someone who'd seen every version of every family dispute and was in no mood for theatrics. Tom didn't look at me when he came in. He sat at the opposing table, adjusted his tie, opened his briefcase, didn't look over once. I stared at the back of his head and thought about the maple tree in the front yard, the one Dad had planted when Tom was born. I wondered if Tom ever thought about things like that anymore. Tom's attorneys went first. They presented the June will. They had affidavits from Greg Callahan, presented as a legitimate financial advisor and credible witness, attesting that Raymond Caldwell had been of sound mind when the will was prepared. They had a second witness statement from someone I didn't recognize, claiming to have been present at the signing. And then they said something that made me grip the edge of the table. They argued that the will submitted by Patricia was either forged or had been improperly obtained, and that my father, in his diminished state after the stroke, had been influenced in his estate decisions. Influenced by me. By me. Patricia put her hand on my arm. Just rested it there, without looking at me. Then it was our turn. Patricia presented the will she held. She presented Dad's letter, his own words, his own handwriting, verified by the forensic examiner. She presented the bank statements from the safety deposit box. She presented Aunt Dorothy's statement. She presented Mrs. Aguilar's account of what she'd heard through the fence. She presented evidence that Greg Callahan was a disbarred attorney from another state operating under a modified name, and that Whitfield and Associates was currently under active investigation in 2 states for elder financial abuse, a detail that had come up during Patricia's research in the weeks before the hearing. And she presented the medical records, obtained legally through the probate process, the records showing the medication increase, the clinical note attributing it to a family member's report, the absence of any clinical basis for the change in the independent evaluations that preceded Tom's involvement. She presented it all carefully, one document at a time, with context and explanation. The courtroom was very quiet for a long time after she finished. Judge Hartwell looked at the documents. He took his time. Then he looked up. He said, "Counselor, is Greg Callahan available to testify?" Tom's lead attorney said Callahan was traveling and currently unavailable. The judge said, "Make him available." He continued the hearing for 10 days. In those 10 days, Patricia's investigator found that Greg Callahan had left the state. Not traveling, gone. Which told us everything we needed to know. When the hearing resumed, Callahan was still missing. Tom's attorneys argued the case should proceed without him. Judge Hartwell was not interested. He said, and I have replayed this in my head more times than I can count, the evidence before this court suggests a coordinated effort to exploit a vulnerable adult, fabricate or improperly obtain a legal instrument, and deprive a rightful heir of her inheritance. The June will is found to be invalid. The will submitted by Hendricks and Park, dated 8 months prior to Raymond Caldwell's death, is found to be valid, properly executed, and consistent with the considered intentions of a man of sound and deliberate mind. He awarded the house to me. He ordered a full accounting of all estate finances, including transferred accounts, in conjunction with an independent forensic accountant. And he referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review. Tom stood up from the table. He looked across the room at me, for real this time, and there was something on his face that I didn't expect. Not guilt exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it, something that looked like the faint memory of the person he used to be, surfacing for just a second before he put it back down. He picked up his briefcase and walked out. I sat there. Patricia put the documents back in the folder, methodically, one at a time. She said, "Take a minute." I took several. "I want to be honest with you right now, because I think you deserve honesty. I didn't feel like I'd won something. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anything close to satisfaction. What I felt was exhausted, sad in a way that had no clean edges. Because at the bottom of all of it, underneath every legal victory and every piece of recovered evidence, what was true was this. My father spent the last year of his life scared. He spent it watching his son drain his accounts and isolate him and manipulate his medications, and he did his quiet, careful best to make sure I wouldn't be left with nothing. He kept those notebooks. He took that rideshare. He wrote that letter. That's not a victory. That's a tragedy that happened to have a just ending. And those two things can both be true at once. I keep thinking about what I would have done differently. Earlier, faster, better. If you were in my position, would you have seen it coming? Would you have pushed back sooner? Would you have trusted your gut before it got as far as it did? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know, because I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. And hearing from people who've been through something similar, it helps more than I can say. The months that followed were slow. Tom was charged with elder financial abuse and document fraud. Greg Callahan was located in Florida approximately 6 weeks after the hearing, and extradited to face charges. Whitfield and Associates was formally shut down. The licensing board began proceedings against the attorneys who had facilitated the fraudulent will, even in good faith. The financial investigation took 8 months. It was painstaking and detailed, exactly the kind of work my father would have appreciated. In the end, the forensic accountant recovered approximately $212,000 of the estimated $300,000 that had been moved or misappropriated. Some of it was simply gone, spent in ways I have chosen not to think about too carefully. What was recovered came back to the estate. I didn't become wealthy. I want to be clear about that. This was never about money in the way people might assume. What I got was the house. I moved in 3 months after the hearing. It needed some work. Tom had begun staging it for the sale, so some of Dad's things had been boxed up and moved to the garage. I spent a long weekend going through those boxes. And that's when I found the notebooks. 11 of them, spiral-bound. Different colors, going back almost 4 years. Dad had written down everything. Every conversation with Tom about finances, every appointment he'd been taken to, every transfer he'd been told about, every time he'd asked a question and been told he was misremembering. He'd written down dates, amounts, exact phrases Tom had used, and then, in the margins sometimes, his own quiet doubt. Is this right? Did I know about this? Check this. And then, further into the notebooks, his realizations. The pattern becoming visible to him. The money not adding up. The increasing isolation. The way questions were deflected. He'd been building a record. Not because he had a legal strategy. Not because he'd watched enough crime documentaries to know what evidence looked like. He'd done it because he was a man who had spent 32 years making sure things didn't fall apart. And when he felt his own mind beginning to slip, he wrote things down so he wouldn't lose them. Those notebooks were his mind, preserved. Evidence, yes, but also just him. The way he thought, the way he noticed things, the way he kept going even when things were hard. I put all 11 of them on the shelf in the living room. I live in the house now. I teach 5th grade 15 minutes away. On Thursday evenings, I make soup the way my mom used to make it, and I eat it at the kitchen table where Dad and I used to sit across from each other, and sometimes I look at the empty chair and I just sit with it for a minute. Don't try to rush past it. The green recliner is still by the window. The Ohio State mug is in the cabinet by the kitchen window, where it gets the morning light. I drink my coffee out of it most days. Tom is awaiting trial. I don't talk about him much. Not because I've arrived at forgiveness, I'm not there yet, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but because every minute I spend thinking about Tom is a minute I'm not thinking about Dad, and Dad deserves more of my minutes. Aunt Dorothy came to visit last spring. We sat on the porch for hours. She told me stories about Dad when he was young, things I had never heard, things that made me laugh, which caught me off guard because I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to remember him that way. As a person, not just as someone who was hurt. She said, "Your daddy was the most stubborn, careful, loving man I ever knew. You didn't fall far from that tree." I looked at the maple tree in the front yard, the one he planted when Tom was born. It's still there. Still tall and still standing and still beautiful. And so is the house. I've thought a lot about what my father did. The rideshare, the cash, the attorney he trusted, the safety deposit box, the letter he wrote knowing I might never find it. He didn't know for certain anyone would find what he'd left behind. He didn't know if it would be enough. He was a man working with a compromised mind and a narrowing window, doing his best to protect something that mattered to him, and he did not stop. He didn't give up. He wrote it down. I think about that when things get hard. I think about what it took to do what he did. Quietly, carefully, without recognition, without any guarantee it would work. I don't have a lesson to wrap this up with a bow. Life rarely hands those out cleanly. But this I know. Pay attention to the people you love, the ones who seem fine, the ones who say, "It'll keep." Sometimes they're holding the most important thing they know, and they're waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. And sometimes you have to be the one who makes that moment safe enough to happen. He tried to tell me at the kitchen table. I just wish I'd found a way to hear him sooner. Thank you for spending this time with me today, genuinely. Stories like this one are why I keep coming back here, because these things happen to real people, in real families, behind closed doors, and they deserve to be told out loud. If something in this story hit close to home, or if you want to share what you would have done differently, drop it in the comments. I read them all. Every single one. If you're new here and this is your first story, there's another one waiting for you right now. Just click and I'll see you there. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.